Hey, this is going to be with all of you here. I want to thank Raul for that very kind introduction, and I want to say how excited I am. I've been everywhere, but I never until today have been here to Paraguay, and I'm very excited about that. And the reason I'm here is that I think that something very important is going to happen. I think we have here in this country today an opportunity to make both economic but also social transformation. I've worked all over the world with many countries now for many years, and I have a feeling that something important is going to happen. But that's going to depend on all of us. On our attitudes, on our spirit, on our willingness to work together, on our ability to see the whole, not the individual pieces. But I think the opportunity is here in this country for something very important to happen, and that's why I'm here, and that's why we are so excited to work with you and the business community and the government and the civil society at this moment to make this transformation. Now, the subject of today's discussion is development. The development of this country, the improvement in the prosperity and quality of life of the citizens of this country. You know, Paraguay is a country with a long history. Some of that history is very proud history. Some of that history is not so good in terms of moving the society forward. But I think today the question is, where do we go from here? We have a lot of history. We all know that history. Where do we go from here? What is the path that this country needs to get on? And what are its opportunities to transform itself? And that's what I'd like to talk about in this session today. I don't have all the answers. You have the answers. I don't have the answers. But what I have is I have, hopefully, the way to think about the answers. The way to think about defining the strategy for the country going forward. And that's what I'd like to cover in this session today. How do we create the right choices and the right strategy to transform the development of Paraguay? That's the question we all need to ask today. What are the roles of the various actors? How much of it is the job of government? How much of it is the job of civil society? How much of it is the job of the private sector? I think in the past, like many countries, the organization that was most responsible for leading the development of the country was government. But I think what we've learned is if government is forced to do it by itself, it won't succeed. So if we're going to make this transformation, I think the most important thing we have to do is actually work together. We have to understand that all the actors in society are part of this. Development is not about the government. Development is about a society. It's about everybody. That's what we're going to talk about over the course of this session. Now, when we think about development, your natural tendency is to be drawn to economic development. That's what we most often talk about when we talk about moving ahead in the prosperity of a country. And of course, economic development is fundamental. Without economic development, there can't be the resources and the income to support a good quality of life. Without economic development, there can be no social development. But what we also now understand is that development is also about social development. It's also about moving the society forward, moving the quality of life of the citizens forward, moving the sense of opportunity for everyone forward. And what we've learned over the last 20 years about development is we have to do these things together. We can't just think about economic development and forget about the society and forget about the people and forget about the quality of life and forget about the opportunities that citizens have. If we just think economics and don't think about society, we'll fail. That's happened over and over and over again. But at the same time, if we just think about improving society and providing more for citizens and making quality of life better, but we fail to make the hard decisions to improve our economic development, we'll also fail. Because we won't have the resources, we won't have the money, we won't have the capacity to do social development unless we're succeeding in economic development. I think probably one of the most important lessons about development that we've learned in the world in the last 20 years is you've got to do these things together. And where we don't do that, we fail every time. I can give you dozens of examples. And so at this moment in Paraguay, as we come together around transformation, we have to have a strategy in both of these areas. And we have to see how these things connect together. What we've learned is that economic development is very powerful in enabling social development. When you have improving incomes, when there's more jobs, when there's more economic opportunities, that creates good conditions for social progress. But we've also learned that without social progress, without the things that it brings in terms of knowledge and attitudes and sense of opportunity, actually you can't succeed at economic development. These things are dependent on each other. And again, we have to develop them together. So Paraguay is going to need to have an economic strategy to address the fundamental economic development of the country and the improvement in the income. But Paraguay is also going to need a really social development strategy to really bring up the capabilities and quality of life and circumstances of the citizens. Those two things have to happen together. And what I'd like to talk about today is the beginnings of that kind of thinking and some very exciting steps that are being taken in this country to put in place this vision. And the third thing I'd like to talk about today is how we get it done, how we get this done. And the big message there is that we need government, we need the institutions in civil society, but in many ways, the big missing piece we need to make this work is the private sector, business. Business traditionally has sort of been outside of these issues. It's been focused mostly on economic. It's been focused on primarily on, becoming, competitive as companies. But what we're now understanding is actually business must also take responsibility for social development, not just economic development. But with a philosophy that is very different than the traditional approach that businesses have taken towards society. So I'd like to spend a minute later talking about now what is the role of business in both economic and social development. The reality is that the private sector is where most of the resources are. The private sector is where most of the jobs are. The private sector is where most of the investment is. And we need the private sector engaged, deeply engaged in both of these agendas, but with a different mindset, with a different philosophy than perhaps we've seen historically. I believe very strongly that this country has an enormous opportunity. And I'll talk about why as we proceed this morning. But in order for that opportunity to be realized, most important thing we have to do is have a plan and work together. And in particular, I'd like to ask every business leader sitting here today to be part of this. Don't leave it to anybody else. Don't trust anybody else. Be part of it. Because we in the business community, I think, have assets and capabilities and efficiencies that will be enormously important to success. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the two pieces of development. Let's first talk about economic development. You know, Paraguay is a country that actually is now showing some signs of quite good growth. And that is very exciting to see, and I'm sure exciting for all of you that are part of it. There's been some ups and downs, but I'm pretty convinced from the data that I've seen that there's a good opportunity to start a good growth path here over this year and next year and the coming years. The question is, how can we sustain improvement in economic development? Not just have a good year, but how can we be on a good path? And of course, the answer there is well known. In order to have economic development, you have to be competitive. You have to build competitiveness. Paraguay has to be a competitive place to do business. Businesses operating in Paraguay have to be competitive in the Latin American and the global marketplace. That's what it takes to have sustained economic growth. You can grow for 1 year by having the price of beef go up, or the price of some other commodity. You can grow in the short term by simply enjoying improvements in prices in international commodities. But to really grow and sustain prosperity over time, you have to build a competitive economy, a truly competitive economy. Now, what do we mean by competitiveness? What does that word mean? What I find around the world is there's a lot of misunderstanding about competitiveness. Some people think that to be competitive, you have to have a low wage. Well, actually, that's the opposite. If you're competitive, you can have a high wage. If you're not competitive, you have a low wage. Competitiveness is about creating the conditions in a country to allow companies to compete, but also to support a rising wage and standard of living for the country and for the citizens. Competitiveness occurs where these two things happen together, where companies can compete, but where workers and citizens can have a good income and a good standard of living. Competitiveness occurs when those happen together. And that can only occur when you create an environment for business in a country of very high productivity. If you're productive, if you can produce a lot of output with a day of work, very high quality products and very sophisticated products with a day of work, you can have a high wage. If you're productive, you can have a high wage. If you're not very productive compared to other places, then you're going to have to live with a very low wage. So the per capita income of a country, we find, is almost completely explained by productivity. How productive the country, the location is as a place to do business. And productivity, of course, has a lot to do with skills, and it has to do with efficiency, and it has to do with a lot of other things that I'll talk about in a minute. To be competitive, you don't have a low wage. A low wage is failure. If you have to compete by cutting your salary, you failed at competitiveness. Competitiveness is about creating the conditions and the skills and the situation where you can support a high wage. Because you can do things efficiently and productively, because you have skill, because you're sophisticated, because you can produce excellent quality. That's competitiveness. Competitiveness isn't letting your currency fall. You know, if your currency has to go down to enable you to balance your macroeconomic flows, that's a sign that you're not competitive. The competitive countries have a strong currency because they're productive and they can support that strong currency. And when your currency goes up in value, that means everybody in the country gets richer. Because all of a sudden your currency is worth more and you can buy more in the foreign markets. And you can sell your work for a higher price. So again, the critical issue we have to understand in economic development is that it's all about productivity. It's all about creating an environment in the country where business can be highly productive. And that's not just local companies, but it's also anybody else that wants to come here and work in Paraguay. Multinationals. We want to not only be a good place to grow local companies, and there's some wonderful local companies here, but we want to be a place where multinationals want to do business. You know, it should be the case that in Brazil's a mess. It's very complicated in Brazil. Getting anything done in Brazil is like difficult. We need to create an environment here in Paraguay where a Brazilian company would rather work here and grow their crops here and make their products here because it's simple, because it's easy, because we're efficient, because we have a good environment for business here. We're not all complicated because government's so involved in regulating everything. Okay, that's what we got to do to be competitive. That's what allows an economy to grow over a long period of time. Is building that capability and then building up the local economy in a way that reflects our areas of unique strength. We need to figure out where Paraguay can build some unique strengths in terms of its economic activity, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But the most important thing we have to understand is that economic development doesn't come because we pass a law to open up trade. It's not easy. Economic development comes only by the hard work of making everything we do productive. Creating all the infrastructure and institutions we need to make business productive here. That's the hard work of economic development. Now, what creates a productive economy? This is a question we've been studying now among thinkers and scholars and economic development people for many, many years. And we're starting, I think, to get a very clear answer. A productive economy starts with the endowments of a country. It's sort of the foundation. Endowments are what you inherited. You have a certain natural resource. You have certain position in the world. You know, Paraguay is in a strategic location between Argentina and Brazil, two very large economies. So that's an endowment. We didn't create that. We were lucky. We just were born with that. We have this location. We have water. We have good growing conditions. We have a certain historical legacy and certain kinds of a history and a natural beauty that might give us an opportunity to develop tourism. Every location starts with endowments. What you inherited, the size of the country, the people living here. Those are the endowments. And that gives you some opportunities to improve productivity and prosperity. But what we find is that the endowment you have helps, but it doesn't truly determine prosperity. What really determines prosperity is not what endowment you inherited, but what you do with your endowment. I mean, you can have very good growing conditions, but if you're not able to be productive in farming, you don't take advantage of that endowment. You know, you can have a lot of potential for clean energy, which you do in this country because of the hydroelectric capabilities and the potential for wind power. The potential is there, but unless you use that potential, unless you make the right investments and put in the right technology and develop the right kind of efficiency in generating that power, the endowment itself will help. You can get some money for that, but the more productively you use your endowment, that's how you really get wealthy. That's how you really get prosperous. You know, poor countries basically just sell their endowment. They sell cheap labor, they sell their minerals they dig out of the ground, they sell those. They do simple things based on their endowments. That's why they're poor, because they're not productive in translating their resources, their land, their water, their energy into value in the form of goods and services that are produced efficiently. So competitiveness and productivity starts with endowment, but only starts there. What we know is the next level of competitiveness is what we call macroeconomic competitiveness. And that says that on top of the endowment we have to create a broad sort of context that cuts across the entire economy, and that's what we call macroeconomic competitiveness. And the most, kind of important lesson we've learned historically about macroeconomic competitiveness has to do with the need for very sound monetary and fiscal policy. We have to have a sound budgetary situation in the country where the budget is in balance. We have to control inflation. We have to create the circumstances where we can maintain the value of the currency. Monetary and fiscal policy is sort of a foundation as well. If we don't have stable monetary and fiscal policy and a central bank that we're in right now that does its job well, it's very hard to develop a productive economy. If there's always worry about devaluation and inflation and the budget not being balanced, then what will happen is the private sector will not invest, will not develop its productivity. The idea that you need a sound fiscal policy, the idea that you need to worry about having a sound, balanced budget, that you need to worry about making investments, government investments that are the best investments in terms of improving the productive potential of the country. That principle is a fundamental lesson of competitiveness that we've learned all over the world. So this is a foundation. And I know that there's a debate now about what our budget policy should be in this country and how we should set that budget and how we should think about the budget. But this is going to determine a lot of your future in terms of competitiveness. if you have a sound, stable process of setting and budgeting in this country and use the resources to make good investments, you'll do well. On the other hand, if you use the budget to try to please everybody and give everybody money for whatever reason they want, you're not going to do well. It's not hard. It's not complicated. The countries only have limited resources. You've got to use those resources well to deliver the best value for the society. So this is a foundation. But what we've also found is, even if you have a sound monetary and fiscal policy, and historically, Paraguay has some good history here. You know, you've never defaulted. You've tended to be more fiscally responsible here than many other countries. That's good. But even if you do that well, that's not enough for competitiveness. Because really the ultimate driver of competitiveness is what we call microeconomic competitiveness. It's not having the sound context. It's really building the capability in the economy itself. And that starts with companies. You cannot have a competitive economy unless you have competitive companies. Unless companies working here use the latest technologies, are sophisticated, that are well managed, that are constantly improving their staff and improving the way they do business. A competitive economy really starts with competitive companies. So all of you in this room that are running companies, you are the front line of competitiveness of this country. And the better managed your company is, and the more up-to-date it is, and the more sophisticated it is in terms of management and supply chain and production techniques and how you do business, you know, that is going to ultimately drive the success of this economy. So all of us in business, our job is to be competitive companies. And that means we got to run our companies well. And we got to make good choices about products and quality and how we compete. We got to be at the world class if we're going to actually have an economy that is the kind of economy we want. But again, companies can only be competitive if they have a competitive business environment to work in. You know, let me give you an example. When I was coming here a few minutes ago, all I saw was traffic. Okay? There was lots of traffic. And everybody was moving at like 3 miles an hour. Okay? Now, if a business in Paraguay that's trying to produce a product or service, every time they try to do something with perhaps ship their goods, if all their trucks always go at 3 miles an hour, can't be competitive. That's expensive. So you can see that having an efficient infrastructure to move goods and services and people around, really important to competitiveness. If you want to be productive, you can't waste time sitting in traffic. So that's why to build a competitive firm, you have to have a good business environment, and that includes a lot of things. In looking at the business environment, kind of the framework that we've developed over the years and tested says that the business environment means you've got to have good inputs. So you need people that have skill to do their job well. And you need good infrastructure. And that's airports, that's roads, that's water transportation. This country's lucky enough to have these rivers and the ability to use water transportation. We've got to make sure that whole system works. and the rivers are prepared for moving goods, so they're dredged and prepared. And we have the right port facilities to do that efficiently and well. So that's part of the business environment. And we need to have some technological infrastructure in the country. We need in our universities and other institutions, we need to build some technological capabilities so we can understand the cutting edge ideas of manufacturing and product design and so forth in our various fields. Now, this country shouldn't try to spend time on very basic science, but really, we're an agricultural nation. We have to build the capability in agricultural technology. We have to understand that if we're going to be a productive economy. Again, it's not something we can't do. We can do it. This is a country that should be a leader in clean energy. So we have to have capability in this country to understand that technology and that field, so we can take advantage of the opportunities we have. The business environment starts with the inputs: the people, the infrastructure, the technology. All those things are critical to the success of companies operating here. When a company comes to Paraguay, it's going to want to make sure that the infrastructure is good. It's going to want to make sure that the people, they can hire people that want to work and that are at least partially trained, so that the company can then train them even further. We need an environment in Paraguay, if we're going to be competitive, a business environment that really supports competition. What we've learned about competitiveness is if you don't have to compete at home, you'll never compete abroad. If you have a monopoly in the local market and you don't have to compete with anybody, the idea that you will be productive, it's crazy. So we've got to make sure that we have an economy where everybody has to compete. And nobody is really protected from competition, because it makes everybody better. And it makes productivity go up. And it's a critical part of competitiveness. We need a business environment where we have availability of supporting industries, so that when you need to ship your goods, you don't necessarily have to do it yourself. There's a good shipping company that you can get to help you. I'll talk about that a little bit later. Again, this is a subject we could spend the entire session on. How do you create the right business environment? It's not complicated intellectually. It's pretty obvious. Many of these things are pretty obvious. The question is, how do you get it done? And that's why you need an economic strategy. You need an economic strategy to decide what are the most important things to do now to improve the business environment. Because you can't do everything. You don't have the resources or the people to do everything. We've got to set priorities. And good economic strategies are ones that set the priorities that are most important today, and then they work on those things, and then they move to the next things, and the next things, and the next things. It's kind of a never-ending process, because you want your productivity and your wages and your income just to keep going up and up. And to do that, you've got to keep raising your standards and expecting more and demanding a better environment and more sophistication and better skill. That's the process of economic development. There's no magic formula. There's no easy answer. It's just a lot of work. You've got to improve your laws. You've got to improve your infrastructure. You've got to improve your technical training. One area after another. You've got to keep making things better. And Paraguay has a good foundation. But, we're pretty low income. And that low income reflects the fact that we have a long way to go in improving our business environment. And improving the capabilities of the companies here in the country. And creating even more attractive situation where new companies will come here to do business, and that will help us accelerate the progress that we make. There's one other critical piece in the microeconomic environment that we have to talk about, and that's the concept of clusters. What we find is that countries, particularly countries like Paraguay that are of your size, it's very hard to be competitive across the entire economy. Because there's just too much to know, there's too much to do. You can't do that. What we actually see in reality is that where countries are competitive, there's a number of fields, a relatively small number of fields of the total possibility where that country can build up its unique position. And a critical mass of firms and institutions and suppliers in that particular field. And that's what we call a cluster. So here's an example of a cluster. In tourism. So the idea is if you're going to be really, really competitive in tourism, you don't need just hotels. Yes, if you want to be in tourism, you got to have hotels for the visitors to stay. But you also need things for them to see. And some of those things maybe are part of your history and part of your natural beauty, but you have to create things that visitors want to see. But then you also need places for them to eat. And you also need transportation so that the tourists can move around. And you also need things that they can buy because tourists like to buy souvenirs. And you want some interesting things for them to buy. And you can see on this chart, actually to be successful in tourism, you need a lot of industries to come together. And that's a cluster, where you just have one hotel and one tourist attraction. You maybe can do okay, but you're never going to really build true success in tourism in this country until you build a real cluster. And the same is true in beef, and the same is true in soybeans, and the same is true in energy. Those are areas where I think Paraguay has the beginnings of a cluster. And what we find is that the true growth and job creation and wage improvement happens where you can build a cluster. If you have just one firm doing it by themselves, sitting off on their own, you'll never see a tremendous growth. What you see is that growth comes when you can build a cluster. Because when you can put these elements together, the supplier, the hotel, the restaurant, the tourist attraction, the souvenirs, the financial services, the efficiency at the airport so that when the visitor comes, they have a good experience when they show up here. When you can put all those things together, then you get explosive growth opportunities. So every really good economic development strategy talks about what are the fields where we already have strength in the country and that we can build on. And I think the answers for Paraguay, some of the answers are quite clear, but the question is, do we have a plan? Have we come together? Has the private sector and the public sector and other institutions, have we come together to agree on a plan so that we can all be working in the same direction with a common goal of driving up the competitiveness by improving the productivity, by improving the business environment, by deepening and collaborating to build these clusters. That's the process of economic development. Now, again, I think the good news is it's up to us. This country has plenty of endowments. Plenty of endowments. Plenty of things that you inherited. Now it's up to you. Are you going to turn this into a successful, high-wage, prosperous economy by doing this work that I just described, or are you just going to sit back and expect somebody else to do it? You know, are you going to have political battles over every issue, or are you going to be able to compromise and improve the road system so I don't have to sit in those cars waiting in the traffic? It's that simple. Competitiveness is your choice. You choose to be competitive or not, based on how you behave as a society, as a community. Whether you collaborate, whether you're effective, whether you care, whether you set high standards. Whether citizens in this country are educated to understand all this. You know, there's a lot of ordinary citizens that don't understand what I just said. They think that their salary comes by some magic. That they're entitled to a job. It doesn't work that way. You don't get a job unless you can be productive, and that's determined by all these other things. So again, it's our choice. And what I am feeling as I talk to business leaders here, and as I had the privilege of talking with the president and his team this morning, and as I get the feeling, I'm getting the feeling that you can do this. That history isn't that great. You haven't done this kind of stuff enough in the past, but going forward, we have an opportunity here. So the question is, can we seize it? Can we work together? Can we develop a plan? And can we do things? Can we actually get action? And I think the answer to all those questions about can we? Yes. Will we? It's up to you. The people sitting in this room could make an epic impact on the future prosperity of this country if just the people in this room started collaborating on this path. That's why I'm here. Because I think there's a possibility for that. A real possibility. I think the opportunity is here. I think you're ready to move in Paraguay for a lot of reasons that you know better than I. Now let me just make a few other points. When we're thinking about competitiveness, of course, we naturally think of the nation of Paraguay. But what we've learned is that competitiveness is not just about what happens here in the capital and the circumstances here. Competitiveness really also is deeply affected by what's happening in each region of the country. And what we find is that we need a regional competitiveness plan, not just a national competitiveness plan. Every part of the country has to understand how it can improve its business environment and its infrastructure and build the clusters that fit well with its circumstances. And the countries that make the fastest economic progress do it in collaboration between the state and provinces and the federal government. And there's some wonderful examples of that. We also know that a critical part of competitiveness, particularly in a country like Paraguay, is the nature of the economic relationships you have with your neighbors. And in this case, of course, Brazil and Argentina are the big neighbors. And your ability to take advantage of your location between these two big economies and to play a kind of strategic role in relation to those economies is a really critical part of your opportunity. I mean, if you look at some of the smaller countries that have done really, really well historically, think of Switzerland. You know, Switzerland sits in the middle of much bigger countries in Europe, but it's created a role for itself, sort of as a hub in between these big countries. It's or a place where it's easy to do business. So companies from neighboring countries come and establish some facilities, here. So this location between the neighbors is a critical part of your economic strategy opportunity, and this is something we need to build into our planning as well. And building the right kind of relationships with the neighbors is extremely important. And I should say, and don't quote me, but the fact that Brazil is so complicated and the fact that Argentina is so complicated, that's kind of a good thing for you. But only if you're not complicated. Okay? So we got to make this place really easy. A foreign company wants to come here, great. It's easy. We protect you. We make sure that things work well for you, that your investment is protected, that your regulations are efficient, et cetera, et cetera. That's strategic economic development thinking. We have to seize those opportunities. Now, that's the economic side. Actually, let me go back. What we've learned about economic development as we've gotten more and more sophisticated about it is that actually economic development has a social component. Again, historically, we didn't understand this. I remember, 25 years ago, and I want to emphasize this is not the situation today, but 25 years ago, the World Bank would come into a country and they would set some economic parameters and require the country to follow certain economic principles, and the idea was then the economy would succeed. The bank learned from that process is it never worked. Because unless they were paying attention to the broader societal, social context, they wouldn't make progress on the economic. So in our theories of economic development now, we understand that we have to include a more social, institutional component. And you see that here on this slide. And so this is the framework that we use for our competitiveness model at Harvard that we've been building and developing over the last 5 years or so, and it's a very powerful part of the model we find from actually looking at the data. This gives us a clue, though, of something I said earlier. We're discovering in economic development the importance of social development. Now, I'm an economist, so I can say this, but we economists are a little bit slow. We get too narrowly focused, but I think we're now finally awakening to the idea that good economic development requires good social development. And that has led me and others to really think a lot about how we understand and measure the social progress that a society must make in order to, first of all, provide a good life, but also create the circumstances that will enable the economic equation to work. Okay? So let's talk about that. Just to kind of provide some historical perspective, for the last 20 years or so, many thinkers have said, gee, we can't just measure success with GDP. That may be a pretty good measure of our economic success, GDP per capita, but it doesn't capture everything that's important about a country and about its success. And so starting with the Human Development Report, which now is around 20 years old, there have been various efforts to actually measure the social side and to include that in our assessment of the progress that a country has been making. This slide also shows some of the other efforts along the same line. The Millennium Development Indicators were very much an effort to measure what are the things that are really important to a successful society, not just GDP. There's been lots of efforts to measure happiness and say what's really important about a society is not how much money you have, but whether people are satisfied with life and feel like they're having a good life. So there's been a series of efforts to measure happiness and satisfaction with one's circumstances, and various other efforts. I was, about 2 years ago, a group of very, very distinguished leaders from the social sector came to my office one day and they had the following proposal. They said, look, we know that you, meaning me, Mike Porter, you have had a long history of measuring on the economic side, because I was co-chair of the Global Competitiveness Report of the World Economic Forum, and I built a lot of these concepts. Would you be interested in working with us to develop a way to measure the social side? And I said, well, look, you're in the wrong place in Harvard. You should be over in the education school, and I'm at the business school. But they said, no, you don't understand. We need the same kind of systematic thinking about social progress that we now have pretty well developed in the area of economic progress. And so, for reasons that I sometimes wonder about, I said yes. So for the last year and a half or so, I've spent a lot of time with our team, some of whom are here, with the support of some amazing philanthropic organizations, the Skoll Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, Avena Foundation, which is very important here in Latin America, on this effort actually to start to put in place the measurement of the social side. And that has forced us to think very hard about what do we mean by social progress? And how would we actually measure it? So let me talk a little bit about that agenda as well, because as I said, if we're going to be successful in Paraguay, we're going to have to do both. We're going to have to do both. And we know, and so how do we think about this question? Well, what we decided was to create something called the Social Progress Index. There's lots of indexes. There's the Global Competitiveness Index, and there's lots of indexes, but really there'd never been an index that was really exclusively focused on measuring social progress. And we made some critical choices about how we should do that. The first thing we decided was that we need to separate the economic measures from the social measures. Traditionally, we just measured economic and then said the social takes care of itself, okay? That's wrong. But most of the efforts so far to measure beyond economic have mixed the two together. They mix economic and social factors together. So for example, the Human Development Report has GDP per capita is part of the index. It also then adds education and some health indicators. So it mixes the economic and the social together. And the problem with that is that it's very hard then to tell what is driving what. Because what we know is that as a country gets richer, its social circumstances generally improve. And when you put the economic and the social together, you're kind of confusing the picture. So we decided, look, we have to separate the social from the economic and measure the social directly. But we need to do it holistically. So much of the efforts to measure how well societies do in social issues is issue by issue. So we measure education, we measure health, we measure water, we measure discrimination, we measure property rights. And there's lots and lots and lots of organizations that focus on those different things. But what we said was, if we're going to understand this question of social progress, just like we had to when we tried to understand economic development, we're going to have to look at it holistically. We're going to have to think broadly about social progress and include all the dimensions together. And so that's what we set out to do. A third choice we made, you see here, is we decided that when we were going to measure social progress, we should focus on outcomes, the results. A lot of measurement looks at spending, how much we spend, or whether we've adopted a certain policy. And we said, well, we're interested in that, that's interesting, but that's a second question. The first question is, what results did we get? If we're trying to measure education, what education quality did we achieve? So this effort is based on outcomes. And because it's holistic, and because it's based on outcomes, and because it covers a lot of different dimensions of social progress, it proves to be relevant for all kinds of countries. It's not designed for low-income countries or high-income countries. It's designed to be able to look holistically across all countries. So in order to do this, of course, then we have to define what we mean by social progress. And here on this slide is our definition. And you can see that it's a very broad definition. It really has three parts. The first part of social progress is where citizens, all citizens, have their basic needs met. Like food. Like a decent place to live. Like sort of basic medical care. That's kind of the foundation, if you will. Are people's basic needs actually met across the society? The second element has to do with what we call foundations or building blocks for a good standard of living or well-being. And that has to do with things like communication and access to knowledge and a good ecosystem that's sustainable to live in. Can't have very good quality of life if you're in the middle of a polluted place where you can't breathe. So that's part of social progress. And the third part of the definition is about the ability of any individual, whoever they are, whatever their background, to actually achieve their full potential, whatever that they can achieve. And that has to do with choice and freedom and rights and inclusion and sort of access to whatever life the person wants to build for themselves. We call that opportunity. There'd never been a real definition of social progress before. And luckily, we had the result of a lot of scholarly literature over the last 20 years that we could draw on all of this literature. But this is kind of the basic conception that we believe is the way to think about this. And out of this definition, we created a framework. And you can see the three big dimensions: needs, foundations, opportunity. And in each area, you can see the components: nutrition and basic medical care, air, water, and sanitation, shelter, and personal safety under basic needs. And under each component, we have scoured the world and found the best available indicators in terms of data of those broad areas. And so in total, there's about 50 different indicators within the three components that we believe represent robust, accurate, comparable data that allow us to look at how Paraguay is doing in this area, in a particular field area, versus Brazil, versus, Sweden, versus other countries. And so, with a very, long process and a very hard process, this framework was assembled. The data was assembled. You have to make compromises because you can't get data that's perfect. You can't get that data on every country that you would like to measure. So we chose, for the first effort, to pick 50 countries. The initial Social Progress Index measures and compares 50 different countries. Now, we released the first index in April in Oxford, England, at the Skoll Forum. The Skoll Forum, some of you may have been there, it's the sort of the Davos of the social sector. And we talked about these ideas with a bunch of social activists, and I can tell you that the good news is I'm still standing. In fact, I think there's been a tremendous interest in this. Lots of comments, lots of ideas, but a tremendous interest. Now, one of the things that we believed when we started this process is, just like in economic competitiveness, if we build this index, it's not the index that's the end of the story. The index is a tool, and the purpose is change. And so right from the beginning, we've had a vision that we would work at the national level all around the world to find leaders in each country that were passionate about social progress and would form local national efforts to interpret the findings and drive change. And at Oxford in April of this year, you know what I was able to say? I was able to say, and I did, that the first country to form a national committee and make a public and private commitment to measuring itself this way and driving change, the first country was, in the world, was Paraguay. And you know what? I can tell you that all those people sitting in that room when I first said that, they fell off their chair. What? Where? Is that Montevideo? Paraguay. And the people that did that are sitting in this room. So here's an example of how, look, you can have whatever future you want. It's easy to think it's too hard. It's easy to think, oh my gosh, we'll never keep up with Brazil, or, it's easy to think that way. It's just not right. You can have any future you want. Here's a chance where this country and some of your colleagues and some of your fellow citizens have committed to take a leadership role in this area. We'll talk about that a little bit later. Now, based on the first effort, here is the social progress ranking for the initial set of 50 countries. And what you see is that Paraguay is number 27 on this ranking. Now, you got to be very careful because this is a limited number of countries. So don't try to compare this to any other rankings. This is a ranking of 50, particular 50 that we chose, partly because of data, but partly because we wanted an interesting mix of countries for the first test of this. But we got a lot of insight from the initial 50 countries. And I'm going to share that with you in a minute. We had a very high representation from Latin America. We have a lot of Latin American countries in the ranking. And that was because some of the leaders in this effort that came to my office that day were Latin Americans. Mauricio Gondogora, Roberto Ortavia, Hernando de Soto. People that believe passionately about this, that were coming from the Latin American context. This is one of the first major global measurement things in the world that I'm aware of that really has its roots in the emerging world, as opposed to having its roots in my country, or the UK, or someplace like that. And that has shaped our thinking and our mindset in some very important ways. Now, what did we learn from this first effort at measuring social progress? Well, this is maybe a little bit hard to see for some of you, but again, all this material will be available and posted on websites, and we'd love you to look at it. But what this chart does is it compares social progress, that's here, and this is the score. And I won't bore you with all the statistics that we use to compute this in the most rigorous way. And then this axis is GDP per capita, PPP adjusted, which is the best way to do that. And what do you see here? Well, you see a relationship. You see, in general, as income goes up, social progress goes up. And we were quite sure that that would be the case. But what we have never known before, until we did this, is that there's a lot of noise. Okay, so let's look at Costa Rica. Costa Rica has the same income roughly as South Africa. But look at the huge difference in social progress. Look at the huge difference. Look at the difference between the United Arab Emirates and the United States, even though, again, they have roughly the same income. Look at the difference between Russia and Poland. Look at the difference between Nigeria and Ghana. what we found is that GDP per capita doesn't translate automatically into good social progress. It's not automatic. And based on the way a country thinks and their policies and their philosophy and their approach, you can actually translate income into much better social progress than in different places. You can do it better or worse. Okay? You can see that. The other thing you see is that when you get to be very high income, things don't improve very much anymore. You sort of see this leveling off effect. And the reason is that, and by the way, there's still plenty of room to improve. But countries, when they get very wealthy, are facing some challenges in continuing to move up social progress. Certain groups of citizens get lost or forgotten. Environmental issues get very challenging. If you're a very high-income country, you have a tendency to consume too many resources and start to degrade your environment. And so we're seeing that in this data. Now, another interesting question that we looked at was, how does the social progress, which is on this axis again, how does social progress relate to government spending? Do those countries that spend a lot in government have higher social progress? And this slide, we didn't put any country names on it, okay? Because we didn't want you to look for Paraguay. But, you know, if you look at this, what is this? It's a dartboard. It isn't true that high spending guarantees social progress. And we'll come back and look at this a little bit later. So some of the key lessons for this I've really covered. You know, economic development is necessary but not sufficient as a measure of national performance because it doesn't capture really the social dimension. Some approaches to economic development actually seem to hurt social progress. The right kind of social progress makes economic development better. And spending doesn't define success. These are some of the lessons, and we will learn more and more and more now that we have this very, very unique data. Now let's look at Paraguay. Again, this is kind of surprising, but if you look at the relationship between income and social progress, the blue line is kind of the sort of average. So if you're at the level of income of 10,000, you know, China is just almost exactly average. Tunisia is about average. Senegal is average. You know, Bulgaria is average. Spain is average. Korea is average. Those are the countries that kind of fit the overall relationship. Now, a country that's down here, like Russia, Russia has an income of more than 20,000 GDP per capita, but its social progress is roughly the same as China that has an income of 10,000 GDP per capita. So Russia is an underperformer. It's doing much worse on actually the circumstances of its citizens than you would expect given its level of income. Not a big surprise, I would guess, to any of you, given what goes on in Russia. And then countries like Costa Rica are doing much better in terms of the social progress for their citizens than one would expect from just looking at their income. Now, where's Paraguay? We're on the right side. Despite, you know, all the challenges of the past, despite all the philosophical, ideological things that have made this country challenging historically. At the end of the day, we've paid attention to this to the extent that we, for our income level here, for your income level, the data shows that you're doing well, not well enough. So I don't want anybody to think, oh, we're finished now, I can go home. We're not finished. Because we've got to drive our income up. That's the competitiveness agenda. But we've also got to drive our social progress up. And if we can if we can stay on the top there, then my prediction is that's going to help us drive the income up. Okay? Now, this is less, maybe this would be a little bit more hard news for you. So if we take all those dimensions of social progress and we kind of look at them and take the data and compare them across countries, this is sort of the scorecard for your country. And we have a scorecard like this for every country. And red is where you're really underperforming what you should be achieving. Given roughly where you are in terms of income and development. The green is where you're doing better than we might expect, given your income and level of development. And yellow is kind of roughly balanced. Okay? So what we're looking at here, first of all, is we're looking at a lot of green and a lot of green that's really pretty darn good. Religious freedom, 1. That's good. Freedom of assembly, 1. Tolerance of immigrants, 2. Now, these are important dimensions of opportunity that make the society better and stronger and more attractive as a place to live. So there's some green up there. We should take some pride that we've gotten to where we are on some of these things. I mean, we're all used to we all know about the reds. But I'm not so sure many of you knew about the greens. Because we had no way of comparing this stuff. Now, the reds are critical. We have a nutrition problem. It's an embarrassment in a food-producing country to have a lot of citizens that do not have adequate nutrition. And by the way, it means that those kids are never going to reach their full potential, including their potential to drive our economy. Here. We have a problem of water and sanitation that is really substantially reducing the quality of life and will have health and other consequences. We have a problem of public education, which you all know about, which we've got to work on. Although we've got good tolerance in terms of immigrants and even different kind of sexual orientations, we have issues with respect for women and ethnic minorities. And what that does is it just erodes the resources available to our society. Not to mention the kind of quality of life for citizens. This is not a political statement. This is an economic statement I'm making, and a human statement. So basically what we are, your national committee in Paraguay is looking at this in conjunction with government that's participating and saying, okay, we need a plan to tackle the areas that are holding us back the most. And the initial choices are shelter, which is here somewhere. Shelter it looks okay on there on green, but the committee believes that shelter is actually for certain groups a real problem. So they're working on shelter, but the top focuses are on water and sanitation, and nutrition, and over time public education. Okay, so that's the process. The process is, just like on economic competitiveness, you need to benchmark where you stand. Where am I good? Where am I bad? Where am I making progress? Where am I not? And then you decide where the priorities are, because you can't do everything. We need the same process on the social progress side, informed by rigorous measurement and accountability for that measurement. And I think we now have that process beginning to be in place here in Paraguay. Again, thanks to the support of government and the participation of government with enthusiasm, and thanks to the National Committee, which I'll show you in a minute. And these are just some of the connections. These things are connected. Okay. In terms of spending, France is here. They spend the most as a percentage of GDP on government, but they don't get, they're basically at the bottom of the advanced nations that we measured in terms of social progress. So that says, yeah, it's great to spend a lot of money, and that's probably helping, but we can do a lot better. We can be a lot more productive. Here's Brazil. I was in Brazil yesterday. Brazil spends a lot, on social agenda. But look at Brazil is not getting, Chile spends less and Costa Rica spends less, much less. And they're even higher on the social agenda. So once again, this data starts to allow us to question effectiveness and efficiency in the social agenda for the first time. Paraguay is here. Again, your spending is moderate, as I think it needs to be, given the resources that you now have available, given the state of your economy and the state of your prosperity. And yet you're achieving, pretty decent, for other countries spending this amount, you're doing just about what you would hope. So again, I think overall, we should take some satisfaction that in many ways we have a better situation on the social agenda than we do on the economic, but that we have a long way to go. We should also take great pride in the fact that we are on the journey. We have a process, we have a group, we have an effort, and we're building a plan, and hopefully everybody in this room can support that. Hopefully those of you in the room that like to be part of it can become part of it. And then we can change everything. We can change everything. This is ultimately about action. It's ultimately about creating a group that works hard on these issues at the national level. But, and let me just take a few more minutes before I wrap up, to talk about what's the role of business in all of this. Now, as I said a while ago, traditionally, when we thought about the social agenda, we thought about government first, and then NGOs. Those have been the traditional institutions that drive the social agenda in any country. And that's not just Paraguay, that's everywhere. That's historically the way it's been. Over the last 15 or 20 years, business has started to realize that it needs to be engaged in the social agenda as well. The first efforts were largely in philanthropy, giving. So businesses and their management and their owners gave money and have been giving money to social causes and supporting NGOs. And that activity has been growing, and I think it's a good thing. It's a good thing for business to be contributing and giving back some of its resources to improve the society, because the society ultimately is going to determine the ultimate potential of the business. It's very hard to have a business growing rapidly in a society that's failing, where people are not doing well. Okay? Now, about 15 years ago or so, many companies decided, well, philanthropy is good, but we need to go further. We need to go further. And that was really the beginning of what has come to be called corporate social responsibility, which is more than just giving. It's behaving ethically. It's following, it's compliance with community standards, and that includes the law, but more than just the law. It's complying with the standards that the society would want a company to follow. It's being a good citizen and participating in the community and in making things better. And it's also been heavily focused on the notion of sustainability. That is, that you can't operate today in a way that will destroy the resources that you depend on. And most major businesses today have a corporate social responsibility program. And in some cases, a very large program. And this is good. This has been a big step forward, because the private sector needs to hold itself to higher standards than it has in the past. You know, we are at a moment today in history where business is viewed with quite a bit of suspicion because of some history of businesses exploiting and not contributing and not meeting ethical standards and not behaving in ways that would be consistent with the standards of the communities in which they operate. And I think we in business have listened and learned and are making rapid strides in addressing some of those problems. But what I'd like to stress today, to sort of conclude this discussion of development, is that today we're seeing an even bigger role for business in social progress. And that is what we call shared value. What we're finding is that actually dealing with the societal problems that I had on my earlier chart, water, nutrition, shelter, healthcare, education, dealing with those social problems is a fundamental business opportunity. And indeed, businesses are in the business of meeting needs. That's what capitalism is all about. Capitalism is about how to meet needs. How to meet needs and how to do it profitably. And what we're starting to understand is that capitalism doesn't apply to traditional economic needs. Capitalism can also meet needs like nutrition and housing for lower income people and all kinds of things like that. But businesses haven't traditionally seen that as their role. They thought that their role is to serve the traditional customer with the traditional products, with the traditional features. And the companies haven't understood that some of their biggest growth opportunities are to meet these societal needs. And actually, that's where the need is in the world. And I can give you many examples. So the question is, how can we get businesses engaged in social issues not just as social responsibility, but as businesses? And of course, every business is going to have a different place to engage society. So let me give you an example. Here's a company that makes irrigation equipment. It's an Indian company. And it's drip irrigation, which is an irrigation technique that uses water very efficiently, which I don't think probably in Paraguay is very well known because you have so much water that you don't need to use it efficiently. But in India or in Africa, the water is a real problem. And this company has been able to work to build an $800 million business selling this technology to small farmers. And it served, as of a year ago, 4 million farmers. It allows the farmers to dramatically reduce the use of water. The biggest use of water in the world, the biggest misuse of water is actually by farmers. Mostly small farmers, because it's very wasteful use of water. And this company has actually had a tremendous impact on that problem, which is a societal problem. We have water problems all over the world, not in Paraguay. That's one of your assets. We got to build on that asset. We got to figure out how to turn that into value for our economy. But that's another question. And as they've helped these small farmers reduce the use of water, it's also improved the yields, the crop yields. And so what does that mean? That means these poor farmers are no longer poor. This isn't a government program. But it's had more impact on water and poverty than probably any other government program. Aside from sending everybody money, that program has impact. That's what the Brazilians do. They just send people money. That's great if you have it, But this program actually solves the underlying problem. How to create the potential for a better income. And look at who did it. Business. And guess what? They made a profit. And guess what? The fact that they made a profit means that they can grow and grow and grow and grow and grow. See, the problem with government programs and NGOs is not that they're bad. It's just that they consume resources. To serve more people, you have to have more money. But if you can get a business solution to one of these problems, it doesn't consume resources, it generates resources. And jobs. While benefiting the social needs that you're benefiting. And we're seeing lots of examples like this. Here's a Brazilian forest products company, a pulp and paper manufacturer, called Fibria. I had a thrill yesterday. I sat next to the chairman of this company and former CEO on a stage like this. I discovered this company. I never met them before. I met this man yesterday. This company has done probably more than any other organization to reduce deforestation. because they've understood how to cultivate a special kind of tree, eucalyptus trees, which you've all heard of, which turn out to be much more efficient in generating paper per hectare of land than the conventional trees and the conventional forests that people are cutting down. And it turns out to be quite stupid to cut down the old forest. That's not very efficient. The efficient solution is to cultivate these trees. But they don't only use their plantations to cultivate these trees, which, by the way, the plantations are mixed together with ecosystem that is undisturbed. Because what they found is if you have the plantation next to an undisturbed ecosystem, it works better, it's more efficient than if you just cut everything down. And they've also gone to all the little landholders anywhere near their operations, and they said, look, why don't you plant a few eucalyptus trees on your land? And we'll buy that. We'll buy that wood. We'll buy that pulp. And you can see on the slide about 30% of all the raw material that they use in their huge mills. They're the largest producer of pulp in the world. 30% of all the material that they use in their plants comes from little landholders, who all of a sudden have a bit of a higher income now because they have a crop that they didn't know they could grow, but this company has helped them do that. This is business creating shared value. This is good for the business. It makes them more efficient. It's helped them grow. But it's good for the society. It's addressing a series of societal needs. This is what happens when the private sector thinks differently about its opportunity. And I think in this country, at this moment, there are huge opportunities for the private sector to deal with all the social problems that I described on my earlier chart. And the reason I know that is because I work a lot in Colombia and I work a lot in Peru, and I'm seeing that happen. I'm seeing it happen. Seeing the private sector step up and engage not just as good citizens, not just as generous givers, but using the business itself as an instrument to drive social progress in a way that actually is self-sustaining because it's profitable. And the profit is good. Well, we're at the end of our time. Let me just show you my heroes. There they are. This is the group of your fellow citizens and organizations here that have come together and made a commitment for the long term to take this measurement tool, which will be renewed and improved every year, and study it and set priorities and engage in planning and activism to cause change. It's this set of organizations and those people, some of whom you may be able to recognize. It's those organizations and those people is why I'm here today. Very impressive. So let's build on this. This country is going to be whatever you make it. Let's make it into a leader in social progress. Let's make it into a thriving economy because we understand the fundamentals of competitiveness and are acting on them. And let's make it into a country where the business community, like nowhere else in Latin America, steps up. And I can tell you that that's my hope, that's my dream. but I think we have the opportunity. I think we have the opportunity. So that concludes my remarks. I felt we had a precious opportunity today to get all of us sort of on the same page on these fundamental topics. I hope you haven't felt like you're back in school, hearing your professor give a boring lecture. But so much of progress in society is about ideas. It's about understanding things the right way and in a common way. And again, I want to thank you all for your warmth, tremendous warmth for the first moment I arrived, for the pioneering work that some of you have already been doing, for the wonderful reception I had with the president and his team earlier today, and with, I think, the enthusiasm that I'm feeling about the opportunity we have. So let's open it up for questions in the time we have remaining, but thank you very, very much for your warm welcome.